everyone, welcome to the very first episode of the Unmask Yourself podcast. I am your host, Saroop Roshi, and also the Miss World Malaysia 2023. In today's episode, I'm extremely thrilled to introduce the very first guest of the Unmask Yourself podcast, who is none other than Dr. Eugene T, who is an associate professor of the Department of Psychology at Help University and also was my lecturer. Dr. Eugene is not only a renowned lecturer, but also an author and a speaker in the field of psychology, especially emotional intelligence. So without further ado, let's jump right away into the podcast of today. Oh yeah, before you go, do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Okay, I'm done. Now you can go. Welcome, Dr. Eugene. It's an honor to have you as my very first guest.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay, so let's just begin with a very basic concept of human emotions. Could you explain what is human emotions and how they impact daily lives in the simplest way possible?
So emotions are psychological response systems. Okay. So what happens in the environment? We have emotions assisting us in making sure that we come off well from that situation. So if the situation is one that is threatening, then we have fear. Warn us. It's kind of like our alarm system saying that, hey, there's something dangerous in the environment. You want to be watchful. Make sure you take the actions to move out of harm's way. We feel angry when we feel discomforted or when someone insults us. So the situation is one that tells us that, hey, someone is offending you. Someone is insulting you. You're not going to take that lying down. So anger kicks in and tells you that, hey, you got to stand your ground. And a whole range of other emotions which help us respond to what the situation requires of it.
Many times there are people who say to me that, sadness or anger is often labeled as negative emotions. So my question to you is that, are there certain emotions that are generally considered positive or negative?
It's easy for us to distinguish emotions quite simply as it's positive or negative. I want to encourage you, and maybe our listeners as well, to think about emotions as useful, but useful depending on the situation. So what we mean by positive is oftentimes emotions such as joy, delight, interest, inspiration. We feel good feeling those emotions, and they certainly serve a reason. But when we call an emotion a negative emotion, it just simply means that we don't like feeling it. No one wants to be feeling frightened, angry, disgusted, maybe even embarrassed all the time. So that's why we label them as negative emotions. Right. But still, it's really helpful to think about the so-called negative emotions as being still very useful for us. So for that, I might want to encourage you to think about emotions as pleasant or unpleasant. Just because an emotion is negative does not mean that it's not useful to us.
That's true. Oftentimes I tell that to people as well, because that's what I learned from your class as well, that, it's okay to feel angry and sad because it's kind of telling us something about we need to work on even. I know how these emotions affect our overall well-being and mental health. Can you explain probably in much more detail?
Great question. So I think there's a very strong link in between our emotions and our health. And the scientific research tells us that regular experiences of unpleasant emotions such as anger, fear and anxiety, and sadness, as you mentioned, prolonged sadness is and often takes the form of depression. These can all wear us down, and people often report poorer levels of health. They feel that, especially if they don't have the ability to cope or manage these emotions well enough, then it does take a toll on their health. So we'll take anxiety, for instance, regular bouts of anxiety, feeling a sense of threat, concerns, dangers in the environment, and we're not able to cope with that. That wears us down. It has an impact on our immune system, which subsequently has an impact on overall health and daily functioning.
That's true.
Absolutely, a clear link there, as we know.
Right. So it does bring a huge impact in the way that we think also, and our mental health in general. Also increases like cortisol level, which then also affect our mental health.
Yes.
Do you think that many people are still struggling to manage their emotion effectively? For example, why I asked you this question is that in recent news, we have seen that, for example, there was this woman that stabbed her partner because she found out that the partner was disloyal to her. So that sort of kind of shows and people don't know how to manage their emotions very effectively nowadays. And there are many cases where, we fight and we act aggressively, whether it is verbal aggressiveness or whether it is physical aggressiveness as well. So do you think that we in general are still lacking in emotional intelligence, even though, we are progressing in other ways?
I think it's another great question, right? And I could
Thank
probably
you.
go on for another 5, 6, 7 minutes on this, but
Go ahead.
Well,
Take the space.
well, without turning it into a lecture, I think what you've highlighted, Saroop, is this idea, and it's actually refounded in the psychological sciences as well, that as much as the environment around us has changed, our brains, our base psychological system, our brains and the capacity for emotions still is very much like what our ancestors
Right.
have. So our
Right.
brain architecture, right, has not changed since the time of our ancestors, but our environments certainly have. So it's interesting you should mention the case of, I think that was spousal infidelity, and people lashing out either physically or verbal aggression. Only need to look to sometimes our driving experiences, and we can see instances of
The road rage. Yeah,
Oh my
correct.
gosh, right? So those are typical emotional experiences, and the fact that we react rather than mindfully respond to them just simply tells us the power that emotions have in overriding our more rational, slower, more deliberate cognitive impulses. That's really
Right.
just a roundabout way of saying that your emotions are going to make you say things, do things before your logic and your rationality, your more sensible side kicks in. Again, I think these are all really more on the basis of necessity. If someone is cheating on you, your partner is cheating on you, those emotions are gonna flare up to tell you that, hey, I will not take this. This is infidelity. This is something that threatens my well-being. Someone cuts you off, right? This is insulting. I'm not going to take this lying down. So very quickly you fly off the handle. There's a term, and we might talk about this later on as well, on emotional intelligence. If we don't have a proper ability to manage, not control, but to manage our emotions, we're very much more prone to something called emotional hijacking, being hijacked or taken over by emotion.
Right.
Any one of us have, most of us have gone through that experience, only to realize later on, I should not have said that, I should not have done
That's
that.
a very common feeling.
So, and that's the case of the emotions overriding your logic and rationality.
Right. As we talked about how we are not as developed in that sense yet, so what are some fundamental strategies or technique that people or individuals can use to better manage their
I
emotions?
think there are many ways to approach, an effective regulation or management. And it's great that you've used those terms as well, because when you say control, many times people think about emotions as something that must be squashed, it must be bottled up, it must be kept aside. I work within the area of the organizational sciences, and many a times it's the assumption that it's unprofessional to bring your emotions to the workplace. So keep it at home, bottle it up. Once you step into the office, right, it's all cold, stoic, impartial, professional, right, but very much devoid of human emotion. I think that's impractical for one. And secondly, I think it's unhealthy as well. So what we refer to as a more healthy, balanced approach to emotion management is by way of regulating. It's by either increasing the amount or the extent, the frequency of pleasant emotions you would rather, but many of us also experience unpleasant emotions. So it means a healthy approach to managing unpleasant emotions is to say, I'm feeling really intense emotions right now, and I would rather not say things or do things that I would come to regret later on. Many ways to do this. The most direct way is to manage your physiology, which is why a lot of approaches to emotion regulation involves calming down your breathing and then waiting, for instance, right, until the rational side kicks in. There is wisdom in the folk suggestion that before you decide to say anything, count to 10, right? Because that gives you a little bit more time and space for the more deliberate side of your brain to actually kick in before you end up saying or doing things that you
try that.
Right?
Count until 10.
Take a deep breath in. You mentioned self-awareness. One easy recommendation, if I could just mention it here, hopefully it's not infringing on any copyright claims, but movies such as Inside Out are great because what those movies actually suggest is that you have to give shape and form to your emotion and not say, I feel good, I feel bad. There is what we call a specific emotion state. I'm feeling angry right now. I'm feeling a little bit annoyed right now. And so it's important to use that term feel rather than say I am, right? Because what you do is you disentangle between yourself as the individual and the emotion. If you say, I am angry, I am anger, I am fear, I am frightened, I am sad, you personify that emotion. But just by changing the language a little bit to say, I am right now feeling, I am experiencing these unpleasant emotions in the form of anxiety, sadness, regret, grief. That gives you some space to say, my emotions exist. They are not me, but that's what I find myself, experiencing at the moment. So I could go on. And probably just sum up here by saying one of the most effective approaches is to be flexible. Not all unpleasant emotions are bad. Many times people regulate their emotions without realizing through one very, very common tactic by listening to music.
Right.
People listen to music because they want to uplift themselves in a certain way. They want to feel certain emotions. They want to hear lyrics, right, from, say, Adele, who empathize with their own breakup experience.
Right. Yeah.
So that's in a way in which people, whether they realize it or not, whether they're conscious about it, they manage their emotions in that sense. So many ways, but all these, to me at least, from what I've described, as far as I can tell, are healthy approaches to a skill called emotion regulation.
And I feel like that's why singers have really powerful tool, and that's why they connect with people a lot, because simply because of the emotions that they could feel through lyrics. That's true. And you did mention that when we go to workplace, people often say that keep your feelings aside or keep your emotions at home. Do you think, and this is also based on some studies, that CEOs generally have lesser emotional intelligence?
Okay.
Do you think that's the case?
I think a very interesting story emerges because when you mention CEOs, so you are essentially referring to people in positions of authority and power who have final say when it comes to decision making across the entire organization. So you're right in saying that the more powerful an individual has, the less empathetic they become. They become less able to connect to or with the emotions of others because of the status differences. So I would say I am not entirely sure about the entire set of emotional intelligence EQ skills, but there are at least some studies that tell us that with power, with authority, with status, with the capacity to influence those around you, it can sometimes cloud your ability to empathize and to connect emotionally. Think about how sometimes leaders, especially those who are authoritarian leaders, really powerful leaders, right? Strongman leaders, right? It's immensely difficult, I imagine, for them to connect with the common man or the common woman, right? Their miseries, their difficulties, challenges are not ones that they experience. And so there's a gap there, a gulf, if you will, caused by the power difference that inhibits or limits at the very least how much they can empathize with others around them.
What we are also saying is that it would generally affect decision-making skill as well for a person.
Absolutely. Emotions has its fingerprints all over decision-making. You're going to make different decisions depending on your mood state, so your emotion state.
Are there certain emotions that tend to be more significant when it comes to impacting decision making?
We look at some of the research, right? And the example that crosses my mind is sadness. When we feel sad, I know we've talked about anger and fear at the start of our conversation today, but sadness operates differently to anger. Might be a little bit more similar to fear in that when we are feeling frightened, when we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling sad as well, we tend to be a lot more careful with our decision making. We tend not to want to take risks. For sadness, that motivation is because we don't want to lose more. When we feel sad, we retreat, we move away, we avoid the situation. And one of the things that we avoid is further loss. We've lost enough, we don't want to lose any more. And again, whether people realize this or not, I know we are in a temperate climate here. It's warm and rainy the whole way through. Certain countries, what they've found is that in certain seasons when the sun is not out, there are prolonged winters, the environment tends to be a lot more gloomy. People do experience something called seasonal affective disorder. And without sunlight, it can be very gloomy. It almost seems the world is very pessimistic. What they found is that people tend to be a lot more conservative, a lot more careful in their financial decisions. During those times when they don't quite see the sun, they don't get that much sunlight, right? So they become a lot more conservative, careful. They're really unwilling to take additional risks. And so that's borne out from some of the research on, again, seasonal affective disorder. Quite tellingly, if you summarize the term, it also spells out SAD, seasonal affective disorder.
Interesting fact.
And that's just one example of sadness. anger, I should just say very quickly, some of the research tells us that it does prompt more risk-taking, more rash decision-making as well. And so different emotions have different influences on the eventual decisions, the judgments, the more rational side and of our brain, the more rational parts of our cognitive processes, so to speak.
Do you think it's because of, if we are feeling angry, it does, lack of better words, does like cloud your prefrontal cortex in order to make your decision making?
I wouldn't be surprised if it does.
Okay.
It does activate some part of the frontal lobes of your brain.
Right.
And so what we do know, and though I'm not a neuroscientist, I know the complexities of the brain. You mentioned neuroplasticity, I think earlier. They work in tandem. So it wouldn't be surprising that it overrides at least your more deliberate cognitive impulses or cognitive tendencies, right? The impulse, right, is to say, go and do this. It's rash, but your emotions are just screaming at you. You do it, and sometimes people feel good for doing it, but they come to regret it later. And I suspect sometimes that's why, in the heat of the moment, people lash out, people hit things, and it might feel a little bit pleasurable or good. Not that I do encourage it, I should say. But after a while, they say, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that." Right? Yeah.
Right. I guess in that moment, we gotta just take a step back and count 1 to 10, and then enter the situation again. And
It's easier said than done.
Yep. Also, you mentioned neuroplasticity, right? It is known to be that our brain has the ability to change and adapt due to experiences that we may face in our life. With that concept in mind, do you think it's crucial for us to include syllabus for children while they are still young about emotional intelligence, so that when they grow up, they can become emotionally intelligent?
I'm all for favor of emotional intelligence as a part of the curriculum. I'm not sure how that can be done or where that will be incorporated in the national curriculum, but certainly emotional intelligence, above all, is an ability. So it's not that you're born with or born without. So it's technically not correct, in my view, to say that this person is high EI, that person is low EI. They can't change anything about it.
Right.
So the empowering thing, and I think the really optimistic thing about emotional intelligence, is that with training, with activities, with all manner of psychological interventions, that is the skill that everyone can learn. They can pick that up as well. And I want to encourage maybe listeners to think about creative ways of cultivating your emotional intelligence. You don't have to attend psychology lectures. I would love it if you came by my class.
It's amazing. His class is always so informational. We enjoyed it, even if it was online.
Yeah. So I'm glad.
That speaks a lot.
Yeah, so I'm glad. Thank you for sharing that experience. So as we were mentioning earlier, listening to music, being a little bit more attentive to the lyrics. And I'm also recently exploring the possibility of, you mentioned self-awareness, cultivating self-awareness, not by listening to a lecture, not by just reading about emotions, but visiting an art gallery.
Okay.
And you would think, why would we learn about emotions at an art gallery? Well, I'll tell you why. Because when we go to art museums, we look at art and we think, hey, you know what? I like this piece, but something about this piece which stands out at me. I can't help but maybe stand and appreciate and admire this artwork for a while longer. But at the same time, there will also be art pieces that you walk in front and say, I have no idea what this is. This is confusing, or this is, oh my gosh, right? It arouses other emotions. But that is essentially a safe environment for you to experience a broad range of different emotions.
That's interesting.
It gives you practice to say, this elicits a feeling of nostalgia in me. And I'm using nostalgia as an example because a couple of months ago, I brought my students to an art gallery and we used this as a field trip for a class and said, what emotions stand out to you? What does this piece make you feel? What do you think the artist is trying to convey? Why have you decided to spend 15, 20, 30 minutes, some of the students, right? Just looking at, appreciating, and finding new understandings emerge from just viewing that art piece. So it's a great way to cultivate emotional self-awareness. We got the curator to just walk us through the history of the pieces, why the artist painted it this way, right? And new understandings emerge. It was a really great experience in cultivating self-awareness of the emotions that we feel when we're looking at the art piece, but also the emotions of another person, in this case the artists and what emotions they were trying to convey through those paintings. So that's a creative suggestion.
Yeah.
I think we need to test that out to see how effective that is.
First of all, I'm really jealous of the students because we never had that. Okay, we were just sitting behind the
We
screen.
were under lockdown, unfortunately. Yeah.
But okay, wow, that's interesting. That's
yeah.
as simple as that. Than that, do you think there are other?
There are also classic ways, a lot of evidence for this, writing about your emotions, expanding on your emotion vocabulary, for instance. Watching Inside Out 2, one example, Inside Out 2 has an interesting new character. So if you've seen the first one, there were about 5 of those characters there. The new Inside Out has, I believe, an emotion called ennui. Do you know what ennui is? So,
No, I don't.
okay, I asked the same question to your students.
Okay.
Have you felt this emotion before? And said, I have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
And then I asked them to do a search on Google. So ennui, the sense of listlessness, the sense of like meaninglessness almost, right? To say that I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm
Okay.
just like coasting by, floating through life, right? And that's my understanding of it.
That's
so you
like
felt
my
them
whole
both.
generation.
That's a whole generation.
It's like
It's
my generation's feeling.
yeah, but what am I put on this earth to do, right? What's
Yeah.
the meaning of my life, right? What do I want to do with my life? Right? So that's one way to expand on what we call your emotion vocabulary. You can finally give shape and form to your feeling states. You go beyond, I feel good, I feel bad, I feel positive, I feel negative. I feel this precise emotion. It's not depression, it's not sadness, but it says that what am I going to do? What do I want to do? But there's so many words that exist outside of the English language that describe a whole range of feeling states. Building your emotional self-awareness through enhancing your vocabulary, that's one way as well to build your emotional intelligence as a whole.
Right. Wow, I'm learning something new as well. That's amazing. We talked a lot about, how the strategies, I even learned a new word, but are there any common misconceptions or myths about human emotions that you often encounter, whether it's in your research or even in your work?
Many a times when I engage with members of the general public and ask them, how many of you feel or wish to have less emotion? I don't want to feel so strongly, and almost certainly every time
I'm guilty of
a
that.
couple of hands will go up, right? And
Okay.
to say that, well, I don't want to feel these emotions that strongly because it gets in the way of logic and rationality. So maybe a little bit less of a myth. I'll get to a myth later on, but perhaps a misconception to say that we can completely detach logic and rationality from emotion,
Okay.
that we can almost in an actual sense leave our emotions outside before we come into the office. The truth is we need emotion to be logical and rational.
Right.
So I often ask people, look, if you go about finding the love of your life and your partner, are you going to rely solely on metrics, objective indicators? And I'm not going to mention this person. I know him. I'm not sure if he's listening. I kid you not, he's come up with a spreadsheet to help him find his soulmate.
Oh, wow.
And it's on a Microsoft Excel document, right? With criteria that's actually weighted around, okay, it's important that this person gets along with my family, this person has shared interests, this person must share my faith, right? And these are all weighted, right, through complex formula. And in the age of AI, maybe this might spiral into algorithms or some shape or form, right? And to say, this is the system that if you assess people by, you're going to be matched with your soulmate. And he insists that this work. He's happily married now, so he's probably got something right. But I'm wondering how many of us actually go through making decisions in the course of our lives in that cold, numerical, logical, data-driven manner. And the answer is very few of us do. Right? Emotions come in. We rely on our gut feel sometimes, and they serve a purpose.
Yeah.
So if you're walking through, and I hope you never do this, I'm sure you're smart enough to not do this, but hypothetically, if someone was walking through an alleyway at night and they feel, I this really unsettling feeling, feel chills, right? I thought I heard something in the back. My gut feel is telling me that I should not walk through this alleyway. I should probably cut out into the busier street where most people are. That's your emotion telling you, signaling to you without the need for cold, hard facts that this is a dangerous situation, this is a dangerous environment to be in. So to completely say that we can disentangle, be completely logical and rational, and to be better off for it because we don't have emotion, I think is one of the chief misconceptions about the nature of emotion and its value to us.
I agree with that. I've actually met people who say gut feeling isn't real, and it's think logically, think facts and stuff like that. And for me, I'm a believer and I always listen to my gut feeling, and so far it has protected me. That's all I can say. But do you think also some people like to say things like, don't be too emotional? Do you think that's
Wow.
bad thing for people to say, or do you think there is such a thing as too emotional, for instance?
I know this is going to be a slightly unsatisfactory answer, but you're a psychology student, so you would know, right? The general answer is it depends. Right? It depends on the situation and on the context. And if we unpack that statement a little bit further, what do we mean by too emotional? Do we mean that we are crying our eyes, bawling our tears out of our eyes to a point where we can't make a decision, we're crippled, we can't get out of bed, right? So at that point, then yes, emotions, I would say, look, you feel the full force of it, right? But is it really true to say that this person is too emotional? It's the emotions doing its thing. I'm quite cautious about saying that you're too emotional, because that immediately shuts down the conversation. It's almost insulting, in fact, to say that I can't deal with this right now, I can't deal with this right now, you're too emotional, right? But these are my emotions to call my own. You have no right to tell me how I should or should not be feeling. It may not be effective or beneficial in that environment, but it's a great way, if anything, to shut down empathy and connection with the other person. Another statement that you might recall from one of our lectures as well, to say that women, for instance, are too emotional. Men are not emotional enough. They're not expressive enough.
Too sensitive.
They're too sensitive, isn't it, right? And this is where the complexities emerge again. For women, it's okay to show sadness and to cry, but don't you dare do it if you're a man. Boys don't cry.
Right. Yeah.
When a man expresses anger, they're passionate, they feel strongly, right? But when a woman does it, cue all the negative comments. So too emotional in this sense also varies depending on who's expressing those emotions. Depends on the expressor, depends on the people viewing those expressions of emotions, also depends on the context surrounding the environment. I don't think it's a helpful term. It's the emotions doing its thing, but certainly there are ways to manage them, to move ahead in the conversation or in that context, even with strong emotions in play.
Right. Okay. Are there any specific skills or mindset that could shift or help individual to effectively bounce back from emotional setbacks? And it was tough for me when my dad passed away 7 years ago, that to bounce back from, to be resilient, even when people tell you to be resilient. A lot of the times people who do, attempt suicide, for example, they don't see any other option than giving up in their life. Because personally, when I went through that situation, I felt like, I couldn't bounce back from a situation. So what would you advise, or do you think that we could actually develop the resilience?
That's a real life question, and thank you for sharing. So I think it's always difficult, it's harrowing, challenging, certainly when you lose a loved one in the family. What I've come to understand about resilience, and I think this is a really empowering message, this comes from some of the work that we're doing related to positive psychology. The idea of bouncing back is great, but we want to think about, right? Because when you imagine bouncing back, if you throw a ball towards a wall, it bounces back. But the one thing absent from that description of resilience to what I think is a more helpful way of looking at resilience is the fact that the ball bounces off in a direction that you can't predict. Right? True. So I want you to think about bouncing back and maybe just change that to the sense of positive adaptation. I will throw the ball towards the wall, but I can determine where the ball will land after that. The answer to your question, I believe, is this idea that I'm just not going to be swayed depending on what the circumstances tell me to. I'm going to make the decision to decide how I want to grow from this point. The meaning, the sense, and the legacy that I would impart upon my father, even though he's no longer around, how do I carry on the good name, his good reputation? How do I live to a point where I know that he will still be proud of me, even if he's watching me from a distance, right? And no doubt, right? I'm sure your dad is really proud of your achievement, right? But to create and craft that sense of legacy, that sense of meaning, emotions certainly can help in this sense, right? One of the emotions that comes to mind is hope. Some people consider hope to be an emotion, others don't, but let's not get into that. That's my lecture side coming in. The sense of hopefulness is the belief, but also the feeling that I have a way out of this, which is quite telling if you consider that when people are depressed, oftentimes they'll feel a sense of hopelessness, right? I can't find a way out and I don't have the motivation to get myself out of bed and move towards the direction that I want to. So hope infuses this sense of agency, but it also gives people the sense that I have ways to move ahead, to not just bounce back, but to decide on the direction I want to take,
Yeah.
to honor my father's legacy, to move on from this setback and maybe a failure on a task or an assignment. I messed up and I got fired, right? Whichever it is, the sense that I still have options in front of me. So hope is a really powerful driver of agency and also more generally of resilience. I am choosing how to grow, how to develop, how to be a better version of myself, to adapt to my situation and circumstances, despite of, or rather in spite of, the challenges and setbacks that I face or the loss that I've experienced in the past.
I totally relate to that. When I was in the stage where I was having suicidal thoughts, the thought of reuniting with my dad, there were a lot of different thoughts, and we were also experiencing financial difficulty. But then I think the very first thing I did was cultivate hope. The fact that, I can easily just die today, yes, sure, but what about me continuing my dad's legacy, because he's such a great man and I want to continue that. And and then step by step, I think one step at a time, I think my journey speaks for itself now. That it works. So I'm the testament for that. And I've seen a lot of people actually, when they cultivate hope, it's not easy, but then it's step by step. It's like you just put a little bit, one tiny goal, and then you achieve that, and then it goes on.
An excellent point. I think you've just highlighted a really crucial element of, resilience and of hope, in that progress is important. So progress looks very different. There's some days where you remain still, right?
Yeah.
And some days you maybe just take half a step forward, right?
Yeah.
However figuratively that means, or what it means to you in your context, right?
Yeah.
But this idea that, hey, I can, lift one foot and just step ahead a little bit, however form or shape or whatever goal that you're taking on. That is in itself reassuring to know that I can do this. Right? It's such a powerful reminder that in the most difficult of circumstances, that I still have something left in me that will help propel me, to move me forward. It may not be today, tomorrow, next week, or next month that I get to that end point, right? But I'm getting there. And it's just that incremental step, that sense of progress that's really, really powerful and meaningful.
Besides being taught in school, the art gallery thing that you mentioned earlier, what are other ways that emotional intelligence can be cultivated among people in Malaysia? Like, do you think parents can play a role, or the society in general can play a role?
I think firstly with parents, and though I'm not a parent myself, I see the value, and I would say the non-negotiable essential of parents modeling the kinds of emotions that they want to see in their kids. I know of families, right, and family systems, family dynamics. I know a little bit about that to be able to say that whatever emotions or the emotional climate of the household, there's a lot of shouting, and that's actually typical of how people get their message across to one another. That's going to carry out as well, isn't it? This person is going forward and thinking that to get ahead, to get what I want, I have to raise my voice. I have to, be aggressive, right? So I think parents are really essential. They're crucial, non-negotiable, right? It's a certainty that they model the emotions that the child grows up to experience and to also express. I think spending time, there's a wonderful series of books, and if you like, I'll share that with you. Introducing emotions to kids. When I feel jealous, when I feel scared, when I feel frightened, when I feel grief even, because losing someone, it may even be losing a pet, for instance, the child's first experience of loss, right? And said, right, pet is never coming back. How do I cope and deal with? I think it's so important what the parent says to the child, because that really determines how they see and how they experience similar events in the future. A quick note, I suppose, on when you mentioned on the role of society. I had this conversation just yesterday at another interview, but this idea of interconnectedness. I think we're blessed with, I think we really need to hold on to this idea that we are united as a whole, as one nation. Regardless of, I think I'm quite tired of any narratives that try to divide us by our race and religion. I'm actually really tired of that. I think it's great to have this common shared identity as Malaysians, and a sense of collective harmony, the sense that we are respectful of one another. I think that also extends to the respect and the acknowledgement of others' emotions. So we can start small, for instance. I think maybe just flashing your lights if someone is not moving at the green light is enough, rather than a long angry honk, right? So it's supposed to create a culture where we're a lot more considerate of one another's emotions. I think simple steps moving forward. That will be just, again, just one of the simplest suggestions I can think of.
Right. I think, being considerate, even in any aspect, whether it is in relationship, in family setting, as society, in a country, it's super important because, it allows us to understand what the other person's experience is. It allow us to empathize as well. Like recently, I think I made an Instagram story as well about racial slurs because I experienced it out of nowhere, and it was such a mind-boggling thing because it's 2024 and we're still holding on to racial comments and racism.
You think we're beyond that, but
yeah, you think that we are progressing, but the sad reality is that we are also not. I believe that your advice about being considerate, empathizing, it's really, really crucial. Before we end this whole podcast, do you want to add anything for our
think
listeners?
This has been a great conversation. So I think just friendly reminder or friendly suggestion that emotional intelligence is something that we can all develop. All of us are still in the midst of developing that skill. I think it's always great to know that there's always more to learn and more to improve about ourselves. Emotional intelligence, certainly. So I think it's a great suggestion to just be a little bit more mindful, a little bit more self-aware, to empathize a little bit more, to manage your emotions, but also to recognize how you can use your emotions to bring out the best in yourself and to see the best in others as well.
Right. Okay, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Eugene. Thank you so much for being here as our very first guest at the Unmask Yourself podcast.
Thank you so much, Saroop.